The Process, a podcast about creativity and experimental music. In the world of experimental music, outcomes and accolades for creators can be uncertain and at times seem far and few between. Therefore, creators and practitioners of experimental music must embrace the one thing they will always have complete control over: the process. This podcast aims to understand this creative process by listening to new works and discussing them with their creators. Each episode focuses on one creator and their music. Understanding how and why they create can inform aspiring creatives and help audiences better understand and navigate experimental music. I'm Dr. Doug Bielmeyer, and I'll be your host as we explore the world of experimental music, creativity, and the human need to find purpose in their world and lives. This is The Process.
Hello, everybody. My name is Erin Rogers, and I am your guest host for this episode of The Process. My background is mainly as a saxophonist and composer. I've been on The Process a number of times with Doug to talk about my work. My career spans a couple decades at this point and is mostly centered in New York City, although as many of you in the music scene here know, New York musicians often travel and take their work elsewhere, and that's been a real nice thing over the years. Though the older I get, the more difficult it is to sort of travel. Anyway, I have a number of projects in New York that I've sort of developed, starting with my ensemble Thing and Why that got started in 2007. I went on in 2011 to found the New Thread Quartet, and that group just had its 10th anniversary a couple of years ago. We're now in our, 12th season and still concertizing, doing a lot of commissioning and performing. Hypercube began in 2014, and that group is almost at its 10th year now. This is the ensemble that will be featured on today's podcast as we talk about our recording of Doug Bielmeyer's Burning Old Man Summer. Recently, I also started a dual project with my partner, Dennis Sullivan. It's a saxophone, electronics, percussion, kind of an everything on the table. I work a lot with composer-performers, and of course, as being a composer-performer myself, it's hard to sort of isolate some of these groups when it comes to instrumentation, because it's sort of like everything is on the table at all times. With my current projects, in addition to a lot of freelancing and composing for other groups, I'm also teaching again. And I took a long break from teaching, but returned to the Manhattan School of Music's contemporary program, and recently took over the artistic directorship of the Tactus Ensemble and the contemporary performance program there. And I'm doing that in a sort of co-artistic directorship and co-chair with Matt Ward. So it's been interesting this year coming up with a way of sort of taking this 20 years of experience and now applying it to the new generation of musicians in contemporary music that are sort of taking the torch. And so that's about me. But we're here today to talk about Burning Old Man Summer, Music for Billionaires, and this exciting new release that's coming from New Focus Records. I believe the release date is October 27th. And so today we'll be listening to a little bit of music from that album, music that I am heavily involved in as a recording part of Hypercube Ensemble. And we'll ask Doug to come on and talk a little bit about the piece as well. So without further ado, let's listen to Burning Old Man Summer from Doug Bielmeyer's new album, Music for Billionaires. That was Burning Old Man Summer by Doug Bielmeyer, and it's been recorded by Hypercube Ensemble. That's Erin Rogers on tenor saxophone, Jay Source on electric guitar, Andrea Lodge on piano, and Chris Graham on percussion. Welcome, Doug, to your own podcast. How does it feel to be on the other side of the microphone?
It feels pretty good. It feels a little strange, but I feel like I'm in good hands, Erin, because I feel like you have a lot of skills and capability here to be a great host. So
the potential is there. I am under practice.
No, I think the talent and the potential is there. That's great.
Well,
and
thanks
congratulations!
very much.
Congratulations on your new gig at the Manhattan School of Music. That's awesome.
Thank you. It's been an adventure, but a great one, and we're all really looking forward to seeing where it goes.
I can't wait to hear all the crazy stuff that's going to come out of there, especially with like new and younger, the next generation of students and composers and performers and what they're going to come up with. I'm sure it's going to be great.
Well, thanks, Doug. And speaking of great, that recording of Burning Old Man Summer, just like to fill our listeners in, the ensemble Hypercube is comprised of a saxophone, electric guitar, piano, and percussion. So it's quartet, sort of based around the Louis Andriessen Hout Quartet, where electric guitar was used as a chamber instrument. Hypercube has been doing a lot of commissioning for this instrumentation, like Ensemble Nickel in Europe, like Flexible Music, a group that came before, a New York-based group. And it's really starting to popularize. There are new groups of this instrumentation popping up all over the place. And this piece, Doug, was written in 2020. So why don't, if you don't mind, just tell us a little bit about what was going on in your head creatively as you were putting this piece together, what was happening.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the sort of precedent for an ensemble like this. And you mentioned too, you said guitar as a chamber instrument or electric guitar as a chamber instrument or chamber music part of an ensemble. And that's interesting because I just like take that as, yeah, of course it is. Like there's tons of ensembles with like electric guitar and like pedals and things like that, or like now, but it's just interesting that you reminded me, like, obviously there was a time even when, you and I were alive where it was like, you can't have electric guitar in an ensemble, in a serious chamber ensemble. Like it would be this bizarre thing, but it was just, it feels so natural now. And then like the whole world of pedals and all the other effects that you can use. It's just such fertile territory for especially new and experimental music. But this piece, like you mentioned, was written in the fall of, I think it was 2020. So that was right when that March, we got the horrible news about, COVID and, there was all the deaths and it was a pretty frightening time. And I remember, there were people like you and groups like Hypercube that were continuing to create music in the kind of void and in the difficult time. And I think that fall was actually the first Cube Lab, is it called, or a Cube? Yeah. So I think that was the first Q Lab, and it was virtual with Charlotte New Music, and that was that was a lifesaver, because I remember just that spring and that summer, definitely being isolated, on purpose, for safety, but then also, losing some of those connections to musicians locally, and even virtually. So it was great to have the fall to write this piece and have that focus. So it was like, okay, I get up today, and I was still teaching virtually, which is bizarre. It's like, have you seen the Venn diagram where it's like apocalypse and like work, and somehow we ended up in the center where it's like still the apocalypse and we still have to go to work. So, and I'm grateful, obviously I'm grateful to be employed during that horrible time, but this was great. This was the reason to get up, right? Every morning being like, hey, I got to work on this piece and I've got to do this thing. But we also lost a lot of like traditions. I feel like we lost like some of the things that we would normally do in the summer outdoors. And we lost some of the things that we would do in the fall. And one of those things, when Christy and I, my sister, when we were growing up, we went to this campground where they would actually, at the end of summer and fall, or start of fall, they would burn an effigy of Old Man Summer. So they would like just basically stuff this effigy of, this Old Man Summer, and they would burn them, and there would be like kids and parades and pots and pans, and and there'd be this huge like edifying bonfire at the end of the night. So as a kid, like growing up in upstate New York, like that was like such a highlight of summer and fall. And that didn't happen. And so all those things, like those traditions and those links, they were all gone. So instead, Christy and I, we just like burned, we like put some, we got like basically a scarecrow and burned it in the backyard when we were up in Vermont. And it was, so it was kind of like, that was sort of like the inspiration, this idea of like we're still kind of clinging on to these traditions. And I'm so grateful that I had composition and that I had creativity as something to fall back on, because if it was just doing Zoom classes, and if it was just like, eating and going to sleep and sheltering in place, I think it would have been pretty devastating to, just mental health and just even physical health. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was an interesting time, and it actually, there was a lot of creativity that came out of that time. Sort of there was, like, say, because things were shut down and because a lot of normal life activity was so abbreviated, there was this extra time and this extra need for expression and creativity, because we were all going through so much in our heads every day, just dealing with the news, dealing with like the impending unknown. And so it's sort of it will go down in history, obviously, but to have created that during that time, and then fast forward 3 years, as we know, what album processes take, they take their time, right? And this isn't it's not like, I mean, we do live in a day and age where it's possible to kick things out pretty quick, but to take the time and to do it right, and to build the album and to set it up, and then to the label to release all of these things, we're looking at sort of a snapshot in time that's being released 3 years later. How do you feel now, looking back on that music, on the way that it's been compiled? How does it sit with you, or does it resonate in the same way? Does it take you right back there? Are you thinking of these pieces differently now? Has your voice changed? There's a lot there.
I think I always go back to, like, listening to Burning Old Man Summer, I go back to that gratitude of having something to like hold on to during that time. But then I'm also like, I have the trauma of editing it for as long as I did. And by the way, when I'm talking about editing, this is not like where I'm editing a performance or like wrong notes or something like that. It doesn't have anything to do with the sort of performance and ensemble. It has to do more with, I have these performances, I have the electronic part, and I'm really trying to sculpt something and create something. It's kind of like a Barrio score, right? Like the score itself is like perfect, right? And it's always going to be lost in translation in a performance, or there's going to be some, translation. And with an album, you can get it exactly how you want. You can try to get it as perfect to a score as you want, if that's the thing you're into. I mean, like, sometimes you'll do an improvisation album and it's about some of the imperfections and some of the things that happened in the moment. But for this, I wanted this to be sort of this is the benchmark, or this is a moment in time of how I thought this piece could be or should be. And it may be performed and changed and altered over time. I probably will go and remix it or maybe reimagine it in some way, like I often do. But I wanted this to be sort of like at this moment in time, which wasn't a moment, it was 3 years in time. This is how I felt about these pieces, and this is how I wanted them to sound.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of how this piece sounds, and sort of going back to our first discussion on chamber music and the idea of the electric guitar and chamber music, can you break down, just going through the piece, what exactly we're hearing? Because it sounds like there's effects especially at the opening, this sort of spatial flow of music. You hear gestures and you can hear the piano, some of the percussion. It sounds like percussion, but it might also be electronic track or guitar. What factors or what instruments are we hearing at the opening?
So, talking about the 3-year evolution of this piece, when I originally wrote it for Hypercube, I knew I wanted there to be a really strong electronic or computer component, right? But I wrote it just as an acoustic piece. And the idea was to write an acoustic piece that was something that you guys could really like knock out of the park, and it'd be like really a great kind of acoustic event performance, but also leave space for the electronic part. So I think sometimes maybe when you were performing, you'd be like, like this seems really sparse here, or like there's an empty spot. And I was trying to, which is maybe not the best way to do it, but that's the way we did it. And write the acoustic part first, knowing to like kind of leave some space for an electronic part afterwards. So, but so that was the initial idea. And then later on, and I think that's when, I was talking about editing, a lot of that editing process was actually still the compositional process of me saying, what electronic parts are going to coincide with this great performance that I have from Hypercube? Like what kind of things do I want to do? What's going to be that interplay and relationship?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting, because over this cycle, or over the course of the piece, it just starts in this sound world. And as a listener to thousands of albums in my own life, I immediately have a reference or an idea of what the sound of this track is. And then by minute 4, we're in a different world. We're hearing, acoustic instruments in their raw form. And that's a totally different sound world, but you seem to get there seamlessly. And I'm wondering how you imagine sort of electronic soundscapes, this idea of space, kind of moving into just dry acoustic, instrumental chamber music, right? And how do you come in and out of those spaces so seamlessly?
Well, it was some advice you actually gave me in part of the composition lab, or the Hypercube lab. We had like a one-on-one lesson, and it was great to like reconnect with you, but then also get, sort of your expert opinion on some of the things that I was writing. And you made this like really great comment that, I've written down in my sort of mental notebook, which was this idea of sort of sustain with instruments, and sort of this idea of how effects can create sustain. But then there's also this relationship between sort of when sounds stop and end and overlap, and often sometimes creating some space. And all those ideas that you were sharing with me, I kind of got this idea in my head of, well, yeah, with an electroacoustic piece, it can just turn into this like wall of sound. Like it can just be this like, boom, here are the instruments, and like you're not sure what's electronic, what's instrument, and it doesn't really matter. And it's just this kind of like sound collage, just like, wall of music. And I think your advice about having these moments of like rest, or having these moments where things, you come up from below the depths of electronics, and you kind of like come out over the surface. I was like, oh, that would be such a cool moment in the piece, to be like, it's like just an electric, just like storm, like it's just like a disaster of like electronics and sounds, and then all of a sudden we would like wake up from the fever dream, and it's just the instruments, it's just the ensemble. And then and I think also I felt like that would really showcase an ensemble too, because then it would just be like, oh, they're doing this all with all this like, with all the CGI and all the backups and all the, the special effects. But when it comes down to it, here's just a chamber ensemble doing what they do best, which is listening to each other and performing and really kind of cutting through. And so you actually like gave me that idea, and I was like, okay, so like there has to be this point in the song where it's just Hypercube, where it's just the ensemble. And so that was really the whole piece. So then 6 minutes later, like that's the so it takes 6 minutes to get there, but that's really what the first part you mentioned is, like this big wash of sound. And it's also an aleatoric part where you as musicians can kind of decide what you want to do, versus the part where you sort of we like wake up from the fever dream, and it's like very precise, and it's very specific, and it's like, get these notes in time, play them, be right there, work as an ensemble. And it's not like a sax solo at that point there, or it's not a guitar solo. It is the group together, making sounds, and and I wanted it to be that way. I didn't want it to be just like different sections of souling or different featuring. That was my, it wasn't sonata form. That was the form, is that we were trying to move to that moment of just the ensemble.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. And there's I want to say an irony in the idea of this. The idea that when, a very busy, loud forefront texture becomes ambient, or when that texture is sort of normalized to the listener, it opens up this door for there to draw more attention with actually less activity. So a moment of silence can sometimes, draw your attention out of that ambient state, or that, that sort of background listening that we normalize to. In this case, all of a sudden we're playing chamber music, and we sort of have a dry, chamber sound, and it forces the listener to listen in a different way, or doesn't force, it pulls them naturally. If I have this on in the background, that's where I perk up and say, well, now I'm adapting the patterns, I'm listening, I'm identifying these instruments, I'm thinking about music in an entirely different way. And I don't think it's unique just because, I have experience as a musician. I think that those types of textural changes can pull any listener out. So that leads me to my next question. And I know that the whole album, Music for Billionaires, is one of the classifying words, and then we can talk about why we come up with these genres for various platforms and what they all mean.
Right.
I don't want to get to that right now, but I do see that the idea of ambient electronic, or the idea of ambience in your music, is listed as part of the aesthetic. And I'm curious what ambience means to you, and in the context of this album.
Well, I think so. Betty and the Sensory World, which was my first album, which was only released just back in 2017. So it took me a while. Obviously, been writing music, since my 20s, since back when we were in our 20s, right? Yeah. It took me so long to figure out like what the hell I wanted to do, and what was the statement I wanted to make. And so that first statement was a 60-minute long ambient drone album. And it was great. It was part of just my process at that time, part of my life. And I just really loved creating it. But it's kind of like what you mentioned, is that it was true drone and ambient music, in that it just kind of went on, regardless of where my attention was at. I could be, you could be doing your laundry, you could be riding a bike, you could be going for a long walk, you could be sitting there listening to like every moment of it. But there weren't these dynamic moments of change where it drew you back in. And so I definitely wanted Music for Billionaires to be an album that had these elements of drone and ambience, but had these really defined benchmarks of sort of chamber music in a way, which I feel like chamber music in a way is a very active genre, in that you want the listener to be very active when they're listening. And we're setting these things up often in chamber music, or in one form of it, we're often setting things up because we know the listener really was paying attention 2 minutes before. So now what we're doing 2 minutes later, they're going to be able to see that relationship. Where, like in an ambient track, you could be listening for, 20 minutes, and the change is very subtle, and it's more of like the changing of seasons, where you're not really sure when it became fall or when it was summer, but now, all the leaves are a different color. So I think it's just like a different type of listening. And I think it's like really kind of fun to mix the two. So you have both passive and active listening happening at the same time. And I've listened to the album both ways too. I mean, I've mixed it. So I've sat and very actively been like every bar, every measure, every frame, just being like, is this what I want to happen sonically? And then I've listened to it other times, like, when I'm riding my bike around the city with headphones on, which is super dangerous in Boston. And I've done it that way too. So I guess I would hope too, as, listeners, they would see fit to listen to it in different modes as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is interesting. I make a point of always listening to anything I'm doing audio editing on, and any piece of writing. I try to listen to any sort of demo or anything ambiently as well as, and that's not because I'm trying to master an album. I certainly don't have any idea how to do that, but just how sometimes as a composer, we can get so embedded in the piece that it's very hard to zoom out and sort of see the forest for the trees. And it's just like having that ambience at moments will tell you when like it's almost like a trick to surprise yourself by which moments stick out, why, and then you can go back and make edits in that way. So that doesn't surprise me that you did that with this album, because it does flow so seamlessly from, moment to moment, and to get, to dry acoustic ensemble from sort of this, wet, processed, ambient, open beginning. It takes a lot of time, and like you say, it's very much like a seasonal change. Like suddenly we're here now, and I noticed that in some of the other tracks too. The Unheard Of ensemble track has a similar moment where I kind of looked up and I thought, oh boy, this is like it reminded me in some ways of like a New York counterpoint kind of moment, where all of a sudden I'm hearing this bass clarinet and this sort of pointillistic chamber minimalist playing, and of course another track on the album, Corporate Responsibility Pledge. So I guess that leads me to my next question, which is, how does Burning Old Man Summer sort of fits in the album with some of the other pieces? Who are some of the other ensembles to hear, and what's going on in the album from start to finish?
Yeah, I think so. Unheard Of ensemble is on the second track, Corporate Responsibility Pledge, and that's the track we hear right before Hypercube's Burning Old Man Summer. So we kind of have the ambient drone track at the start, which is Wells Main. And that's like, so if you're listening to that, you're just like, oh man, it's going to be another 60-minute drone album. And then I like this idea, then it's like, well, no, it's not. Now it's chamber music. So those two pieces kind of occur in their chamber music. And then the rest of the album sort of deals with, let's recycle the materials that are in those chamber pieces in ambient ways, in straight up like, Schaefferian sound montage way, a very like as Cumatic or as Cumaniac style of just, very pointillistic kind of non sequitur electronic music. And then there's even a track later on, Slow Dance 84, which is just like my love of 80s. I can't do anything about it. I'm sorry, I can't change. I just love really cheesy 80s pop music. And so that was kind of my homage to that track. And when I created that, once again, it was a very straightforward sort of additive track using guitar and synths in a very kind of 80s way. But I'm, putting over it the Schaefferian sound montage idea and concept, as well as then just a local jazz drummer here in Boston, John Dalton, to just kind of do some free improv drums over the top. And so I just wanted to have the track be a bunch of things all at once. And I don't know, we talk about experimental music and like what that means. I feel like, I think like pitch wise or tonally, like what I'm doing, I don't think I'm experimenting so much with that. I think what I'm trying to do when I'm experimenting is like, what genres can I mix together, and how can I put two things that are probably pretty straightforward in both of their genres, but by pairing them together, it creates something different. And, sometimes it's really interesting. Other times it's just, it's just like bad jazz or bad chamber music, but sometimes there's this really fertile connection. And then the world gets like really small too, because you're like, so if you can mix this music with that music, then there must be some universality between what both musics are trying to accomplish.
Mm-hmm. And to that end, it sort of brings up the next question, like where does Doug Bielmeier as composer cross over to Doug Bielmeier as audio engineer, to Doug Bielmeier as producer, to Doug Bielmeier as performer in some cases with some of these. It's not a traditional album where you have composed these pieces and these ensembles and players have played it. You have such a integrated role in every piece in a different way. Just talk a little bit about how you, especially, I'm especially interested in sort of how what you said at the very beginning of our conversation, which is how much audio engineering or audio edit or post-production editing is linked to composition, and where just sort of how you imagine this classification, if there are sharp edges.
That's great. So the idea to me that I would write a piece on paper and hand the score to an ensemble, and the ensemble would play it, give me some notes, and then perform it, and that would be the piece. There are many composers that can do that, and they do it very well, and I'm in awe of those composers. That is not my process. And for one reason or another, I rely quite a bit on revision and a lot on, let's get an idea down, let's get some basic sounds, and let me record that. Let me get that into a computer program. Let me get that into Pro Tools. Let me get that into a DAW or Ableton. I've been using a lot lately. Let me get it in there. And now I have like these colors and I have a palette, but let me go and mess around with it. And so the studio now has become like so important to the composition process. Like if there was ever like write a symphony, like, if somebody had a gun to my head and said, could you write a symphony and give it to the orchestra and they play it, I would really struggle with that. Because the studio has become such part of the process of recording, re-recording, using effects, mixing it, and then being like, oh no, this doesn't work. Like just like mixing it and being, this doesn't work, and adding other things. One of the things we did in Burning Old Man Summer is you all did a fantastic performance of the piece. And you and I did, we actually did a remote session at Skillman Studios with Way, and we just re-recorded the saxophone part. And it was really more of, you gave a fantastic performance in the original. So it wasn't about, getting a different or better or opposite performance. It was more about the ambience of how we recorded the saxophone. And I wanted a really tight, close saxophone sound for this song. And so re-recording it in a much smaller studio alone, and having that then to like mix with what you did with the rest of the ensemble, that helped me get that kind of vision I had for the saxophone sound. So I guess that's part of the thing too, is I'm not just envisioning like the music, I'm also envisioning like, how is this going to sound over speakers or over headphones? Because for me, it's really weird. I think it's just because my heroes, like growing up in America and listening to albums, I think my heroes are obviously like these great composers, but these people that created these albums that are like sonic worlds unto themselves. I think that's the thing too, is like, I see my role as a composer, not just writing the piece and overseeing getting it performed and kind of communicating with the musicians to have that performed. I'm less interested in the performance. I think I'm more interested in the documentation of it, the version of it that could be in a final state. So I just think that's why the technology is so involved in my process, is because it's not that I like have less value in the performance, but I'm not as focused on that. I'm focused on like making albums, which I think is more of like a pop, kind of, perspective or commercial music perspective of like, you put albums out and there's content and yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the idea of an album on it, as its own document, versus the live concert, the tour experience. It goes back a long ways, and I think both are great in terms of just being able to experience music in different ways. The energy of a live performance. Maybe you don't get the nuance of the hot mic or you can't. Right. There are certain limitations to live sound, of course, but like the idea of that composer can now dial in those micro sounds, those very small elements, and bring them to the fore, or you can do the opposite, right? We can pull things way to the back. We can mess with different mixes. It's just there's so much we can do, sort of even a DIY kind of way now with technology and with just the advancement of recording engineering and software and everything. So having a bird's eye view like you do probably helps a lot with the, probably moves back to the conception of the pieces too. I mean, with Burning Old Man Summer, you said you were hearing it as the studio version, prior to the first performance, which is, very interesting.
And, with only so many hours in the day, I mean, you can write a piece and have it performed, which I think is a fantastic in an art in itself. You can then conceive how it would be recorded in like a studio version. And that's a whole world as well. But then, as you just mentioned, there's this whole world of, okay, so I created this perfect thing, quote unquote, perfect thing in a studio. How do I perform this live? And how do I make that as exciting experience, and not just be like, hey, we're just playing the CD right now, like, thanks for coming out to the CD release party. How can you make that a worthwhile and exciting experience? And so, like, there's only so many hours in the day. I mean, like, you could, so I think that's a world that I'm excited moving forward to get more into, is like, doing the composition part, doing the studio, the album side of it, but then also, pushing the boundaries of creating performances then that really incorporate both of those.
It's been great to hear about your process on this album, Doug. And it's also been a pleasure to be the host of the process.
Well, Erin, thanks so much for being a host. You're an absolute natural. And I mean, it was really great. You had fantastic questions. And also, I think it was just, thanks for really kind of pushing me to think about this a little bit more. But before we go, and I always do this at the end, I like normally on the show, I'm like, before we let you go, you have all this amazing stuff going on in your composition life, teaching, all the things that you do. What are some great new exciting things that are coming up in the next few weeks here that especially we have listeners in the Boston and New York area that they can come and check out some of these events that you're doing?
Sure, yeah. So October 9th is actually the first Tactus Ensemble concert of the year, and as mentioned, as the artistic director of this ensemble, there are 6 concerts per season that occur at Manhattan School of Music. They're all free and open to the public. And we're programming works that are voices of today, voices of the 20th century in some cases, but that all feature these young, fantastic players in their element. And the first of the season is October 9th, and that takes place at Manhattan School of Music on the Upper West Side on Claremont Ave. And you can catch that, I believe, 7:30 on the 9th. It's a Monday evening. The Cypher Ensemble, an ensemble that is just player, performer, electronicists, composers. They have their roulette concert happening on October 23rd, I believe. That show is that will feature works by Bora Yoon. It will be the New York premiere of my piece Telegraph for them, and we want to talk about incorporating electronics into performance, live performance, and dialing in sounds. That's a very performative piece, and I'm really excited that they'll be taking that on.
And that's something Decipher really focuses on too, is like translating those sort of pieces to the performance realm.
Yeah, they're fantastic, and it's been really fun to work with them. October 18th, Pope Bama, my duo project, will be performing at Mise en Place, and we're doing a number of performances in New York this fall. So this will be one that you should try to catch, and if you haven't been over to Eastern Greenpoint, it's a great space, and we're going to have it fully decked out with almost every possible electronic element and sound element and percussion instrument that we can in there, since we do have a lot of setup time. So that's a show we're looking forward to. And then of course we'll have Hypercube performances. Cube Lab 5, which is the 5th iteration of the Cube Lab we were talking about, that started in 2020 during the part of the pandemic. We actually found that model to be really successful in that it brought composers from all over the world really to an online platform to work together and to build pieces for our ensemble. So we'll be broadcasting 2 performances from Cube Lab 5, and then we'll be playing live in the beginning of November. I believe that's November 14th. No, mid-November. And that will be at School Street Studio. So a lot of things coming up this fall, and I hope you can make it out to some.
Thanks to Erin for being a wonderful guest host. Check out all those great events and all those links Erin shared with us. And as always, check out Music for Billionaires, releasing on New Focus Records this October 27th. If you enjoyed this episode, there's more to come for the rest of the album, as well as a few more surprises for Season 4. So like, subscribe, or leave a comment on your preferred podcasting app. As always, I'm Dr. Doug Bielmeyer, and this has been The Process.